As the last ray of sunlight touched the treetops, the dense forest was enveloped in darkness. This forest was home to many animals, each with its own unique story. The forest had its own life. Changes were constantly happening, from the changing of seasons to the arrival of new inhabitants. Deep within this forest, in a secluded cave, lived a wolf named Jack. Jack was known among the forest dwellers for his wisdom and strength, but lately he felt that something was amiss. Jack often wandered through the forest alone, enjoying the silence and tranquility. But one day, he began to notice that the silence no longer brought him satisfaction. He felt something undefined creeping into his soul. In these moments, Jack thought about how his life had become too predictable, too ordinary. However, the thought of change frightened him. Jack was used to his routine, where everything was in its place. Every morning he went out to hunt. Every evening he returned to his cave, and so day after day. One day, as Jack walked along the river, he noticed that his shadow seemed particularly large and frightening. In the light of the setting sun, his shadow stretched to incredible lengths, as if trying to engulf him. Jack had never paid much attention to it before, but now it had become a symbol of his fears. He realized that his shadow was his own reflection, his fears and doubts that he had buried deep inside. From that day on, Jack began to avoid places where his shadow could be seen. He started wandering the forest only at dusk or staying in his cave when the sun was at its peak. His life became confined, and he felt like he had imprisoned himself. Every time he met someone from the forest, he was overwhelmed by the fear that someone would notice his weakness. Why am I so afraid of change? Jack wondered as he sat at the edge of his cave, looking at the forest that had once been a source of joy for him. But no answer came. An inner voice kept telling him that it was better to stay safe in a familiar environment than to risk and change something. Jack tried to convince himself that everything would remain the same if he just avoided his shadow, but this only made his fears stronger. One evening, as the shadows grew particularly long, Jack met an old wise owl named Ellie. Ellie was known in the forest as the keeper of ancient knowledge and a counselor for those in trouble. She quietly flew up to Jack and asked, "Jack, why have you become so sad and withdrawn? Where is the brave wolf I once knew?" Jack sighed and decided to tell Ellie about his fears. "I'm afraid of change," he began. "Every time I think about changing something in my life, I feel fear rising within me. My shadow has become a symbol of that fear, and I don't know how to deal with it." Ellie listened carefully to Jack and, flapping her wings, sat down beside him. "Jack, your shadow is just a reflection of yourself. It can't harm you. If you hide from it, you're hiding from yourself. But if you decide to face your shadow head on, you'll see that it's not scary at all." Ellie's words touched something deep within Jack. He understood that his fear was his own creation, but the thought of confronting it still scared him. However, after much contemplation, Jack decided it was time to change something. He realized that living in constant fear and limitations was not a life. The next day, Jack decided to go to his favorite spot on the hilltop. This was a place where he loved to spend time, enjoying the view of the forest. But this time, he came not to admire the scenery, but to face the biggest shadow he had ever seen. When Jack reached the hill, the sun was already high in the sky, and his shadow stretched far ahead of him. He felt fear rising inside him, but decided not to retreat. "It's just a shadow," he repeated to himself as he approached its outlines. Jack stopped right in front of his shadow and looked at it. His heart was pounding, but gradually he began to realize that his shadow was just a shadow. It couldn't harm him, couldn't stop him. It was just a play of light and shape. Jack felt something change within him. The fear that had held him captive for so long began to dissipate. He was no longer afraid of his shadow and therefore no longer afraid of change. He realized that change was a natural part of life, and it didn't always mean something bad. On the contrary, it could lead to new opportunities and discoveries. Over time, Jack began to return to his usual way of life, but now he did so with new eyes. He no longer avoided places where he could see his shadow. Instead, he sought them out. He realized that every shadow was just a reminder of his own strength and courage. Soon, rumors began to spread in the forest that Jack had changed. He had become more confident, his gait once again firm and resolute. Other animals began to notice that Jack was no longer afraid of new challenges, and this inspired them as well. One of those who noticed the change in Jack was a deer named Michael. Michael had always been cautious and indecisive, but seeing how Jack had overcome his fears, he decided to ask him for advice. "Jack, how did you manage to overcome your fear?" he asked one day when he met the wolf on the trail. Jack smiled and said, "Michael, fear is just a shadow, and it can't harm you unless you allow it to. If you avoid it, you'll live in the shadows, but if you can face it head on, you'll see that it's not scary at all." Michael thought about Jack's words. He realized that his own fears were also a shadow that had been holding him back. He decided to try to do as Jack did, to face his fears head on. The next time Michael was faced with a choice, to stay in his comfort zone or take a risk, he remembered Jack's words and took a step forward. He felt the fear begin to retreat, and for the first time in a long time, he felt free. Jack's story became a legend among the forest animals. It was passed from one to another, inspiring everyone to fight their own fears. The animals realized that the fear of change was just a shadow, and if they could face it head on, they could reach new heights in their lives. Jack became known not only for his strength and wisdom, but also for his courage. He taught many that fear was an illusion, and that true bravery lay not in hiding from it, but in facing it. His life changed, and he became an example for others. As we conclude our story today, I want to remind you that change is a part of our lives, and it brings not only challenges, but also new opportunities. Don't be afraid of your fears, for they are just shadows that can't harm you unless you allow them to. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and write in the comments about the changes that have happened in your life and how you dealt with them. See you next time.